Namco Xevious could be called one of the most iconic shmups ever developed. It feels simple now, but by breaking the grounds of a single screen playfield, it truly redefined the genre, making it extend far beyond the bounds of the gallery shooters which came before. But a scrolling playfield was not its only innovation. With the addition of both air and ground targets, being able to juggle which of them is the greater threat makes for engaging action, as one dodges the waves of enemy craft whilst delivering a precisely positioned blast to take out an enemy emplacement or ground vehicle. Thus, it is no surprise at all to see it make the jump from the chaos of the arcades and into the more comfy space of one's home, with ports to various home micros and consoles. Firstly, we're going to jump onto the humble ZX Spectrum conversion, handled by Probe Software and published by US Gold in 1987. The first thing you notice on firing it up? That's the aspect ratio. Many arcade shmup translations to home micros tried to offer the full screen experience, and whilst it was a design choice to reduce the area needing to be updated every frame, the result is more than worth it, for both speed as well as being able to see more of what lies ahead. The audio is where things greatly differ. Xevious is designed around the humble 48K Spectrum and its simplistic beeper over the more advanced AY sound chip included in the newer 128K machines. As a result, what is here is simplistic beeps for the audio, and whilst it might sound like a downgrade to some, for me, it's kind of not. The main advantage, of course, especially if one's not a fan of the infamously short in-game music of the arcade machine, is that it's a chance to be spared from it, and honestly for me, it's a bit of a half and half scenario. On the visual front, the challenges of colour clash is something that's always fun for Spectrum developers to wrangle with, so the monochromatic style here is not really a surprise at all, and it generally works pretty well, especially over land, with the game objects drawn in black contrasting quite nicely over the solid green background. Sadly though, it's a whole other story when it comes to the water sections, as instead of a solid colour or even a minimally textured pattern for the water, they've gone with a detailed pattern to simulate waves, making the foreground craft much harder to read as a result. Sitting here playing it on my 128K Spectrum with its RGB output made it hard enough to see when recording this footage, but for those who may be running it on an original 48K machine via the classic RF connection, I'm genuinely convinced that it would be incredibly tough to distinguish things at time during these sequences, resulting in quite a visual mess. The most important feature of any conversion is how the mechanics translate though, and honestly, I find this Spectrum conversion to do a pretty darn solid job. The pacing is intact, making the challenges involved in surviving both the air and ground targets feel reasonably engaging, especially compared to its arcade parent. The controls generally work great, offering not just the traditional assortment of joystick options, but also redefinable keys, and yes, even the ability to play two players, letting you and a friend take it in turns to blast your way for that high score. Next up, we're looking at another adaptation published by US Gold, that being for the trusty C64. This was actually how I first experienced the game as a kid, not actually playing the original cabinet until much, much later on. Now, they say first impressions are everything, and honestly, seeing that title screen once again is not imbuing me with confidence, let alone a positive first impression. From the usage of the C64's system font to the general hollowness of what you see on screen. I know it came out in 1987, but it truly feels like the type of front end one might have seen on an Atari soft release several years prior. Sure, you've got the option to have 1 or 2 players, alongside the ability to customize your difficulty, which results in more starting lives. You might consider it cheating, but I like to think of it as adjusting the dip switches inside the cabinet. Then, it's onto the battle, and as I look at it now, the feelings from its first impressions drop even lower. Much lower. The greatest feeling for me is the general sluggishness, which truly makes it a drag to play, especially when you're playing it alongside the arcade machine, where everything progresses at a far more reasonable rate. The visuals truly feel rather flat to me, despite the metallic colour palette of both your Savalu fighter and the invading forces. There's a feeling that it just kind of clashes. What's worse is the bullet sprites, using a colour choice which is guaranteed to make them blend way too easily into some of the backgrounds. Then there's the audio, and it doesn't do wonders either. The music of the arcade game, as I mentioned earlier, is one of those love it or hate it deals, and its translation onto the mighty SID chip does not offer many points to the love it camp. It's a bit of a poor rendition which stands out for all the wrong reasons, and even the sound effects don't feel that great on top of it. On the upside though, the controls, driven by your standard joysticks, do work pretty well, but when one is fighting against the general sluggishness of the game, it's hard to truly say they're great. And when looking at some of the reviews from back in the day, it's really tough to call this conversion anything but a mess, honestly. With the C64's popularity in the US around this time frame, it's no surprise to see that it was also brought over the Atlantic for a US release. This was put into the hands of Mindscape, who also commissioned a conversion to another 8-bit platform, the Apple II. In many regards, Woz's humble machine is quite similar capabilities-wise to the Spectrum in that it's probably not entirely suited to this kind of game. And when you see the decision to use full-screen scrolling, you may be expecting the worst. That isn't the case here, with the results being quite solid. Despite the idiosyncratic nature of the Apple II's high resolution, seeing full colour here is especially impressive, running at quite a solid speed. Well, most of the time anyway. Generally this results in a very solid conversion to play, but you get to this one point on Wave 2 where enough enemies spawn in to really knock the pace down a bit. Thankfully the game generally responds as well as before, but the slowdown does make it tough to get through. In fact, I'd go as far to say as it was my main pain point when recording the footage for this video. After enough attempts and many lives lost, I did finally get through, but it certainly made for a tough challenge. What is potentially more of a letdown though is the controls. When the Spectrum and C64 both use digital joysticks, the Apple II as a platform was designed around analog controls, originally stemming from a set of paddle controllers. Analog controls are something which you really don't want in a shooter, and honestly it was quite the painful part of playing this. Thankfully, there are modern alternatives, and that truly saved the day here during my session when I was recording footage, making it far more fun to play. In another point similar to the humble Spectrum, the sound doesn't offer much here, just simply spot effects you're firing alongside enemies being blown up. And once again, it's a blessing in disguise, simply because whilst an average play of Xevious in the arcades means one isn't exposed to the music for an excessive period of time, it can become quite a bigger pain on a home system, at least in my book. So if you don't mind me, I'll certainly be celebrating its absence here as well. Finally, it's time for the heavy hitter, as Namco themselves brought Xevious across to the MSX2 in 1988 with Xevious, the Faudraut Saga. Whilst it's not the first follow-up to be released, it is the first to expand the formula over just cranking up the difficulty. the first sign of just how special it is really comes from the main menu, where there is 2 game modes on offer, Recon and Scramble. Recon mode serves as an adaptation of the arcade game, and plays just as you'd expect. Visually, it uses the extra capabilities of the video hardware in the MSX2 specification to bring graphics coming close to the arcade, with them almost taking up the entire screen, though in a landscape aspect, scrolling incredibly smoothly as well. The action is just as engaging as you'd expect, making for one of the best adaptations of Xevious to home platforms. Well, at least before Namco would put out the various Namco Museum compilations. If that's all the package was, it would make for a fine release there and then, but you'd ignore Scramble mode, and that's truly where you're going to be spending the bulk of your time. Where Recon mode sets things up as a recon flight against a small force, the Scramble mode paints a much bleaker picture, with the Earth now under heavy invasion and having suffered many losses. It's down to a few pilots to save the day. You won't just be taking up the classic Savalu fighter here, but rather you've got the opportunity to choose between it and 3 other fighters, bringing way more firepower to bear. Starting with Zeodali, which adds a rear firing spread shot, though for me this feels a little unnecessary, as there aren't many enemies which attack from behind. My favourite has got to be Solgrado, which offers the same wide angle shot, but fires it forwards, and I'm not gonna lie, this really was the most effective weapon for me. Finally, you've got Gamp Mission, the big heavy variant, which is a gestalt of the other 3 craft. Alongside that forward spread shot, you've also got one handy upgrade for your bombs, which can now do damage to a larger area. The ability to make these selections becomes quite interesting, as rather than sticking with a single craft throughout your run, you can pick and choose to make an effective fleet based on your desired playstyle. There is a downside to this, however. As you customise your fleet, the score you'll need to hit to earn an extra life will change. If you fill up your fleet with heavy hitters, then it may be possible to set a target score which you'll never quite hit. With your fleet configuration out of the way, it's time to scramble. Things may start out resembling Recon mode, but the stages quickly divert from those levels, offering up their own challenges and surprises. The most apparent of these are the power-ups. You absolutely heard me, Xevious now has power-ups. These are found by bombing the ground targets you'll encounter, and include handy items like a vastly improved firing rate, a shield which lets you take an extra hit before dying, and an upgrade to your bombs, making them far more lethal in taking out a larger area. You might think that power-ups would bust the formula. Oddly enough, they don't. You still need to be great with your joystick skills to survive the onslaught, but honestly, I think it's a great benefit because it takes the edge off things just a little bit. Because let's face it, Scramble mode can be quite a tough challenge, and it shouldn't be a surprise that it is, because even the original arcade game was a challenge in its own right. Well, you find that, unsurprisingly, there's a fair amount of reuse in the sprite and background graphics based on what was done for the Recon mode. You'll find a few new ground details you'll encounter as you blast your way forwards. Despite how well they're drawn technically, I can't help but feel they're a little out of place though, as the extra detail does clash a bit with the simpler graphics found in the original artwork. For those who side in the hate-it camp for the music, I do have some good news however. Each of the new craft in Scramble mode includes their very own soundtrack. It's not entirely new, and it still doesn't run for that long before it loops, but for me, I happen to find them a little less harsh on the ears than the tune associated with the arcade game, and that is a fine improvement in my book. Unsurprisingly, the controls are precise and responsive, They make great use of the dual fire buttons, which are found on many MSX game controllers, in order to replicate the control setup of the arcade machine. As an aside though, I really wish I had an arcade stick for my MSX here, as playing it with the gamepad really started to cramp my style after quite a bit playing when grabbing footage for this video. Xevious holds an important place in arcade gaming history. The first true vertically scrolling shmup, the first with separate air and ground targets, amongst many other details. Whilst its pace may feel a tad slow for those used to the likes of Cave's work, it's still quite a fun game to enjoy in its own right. As for these conversions though, I was genuinely impressed with the Apple II version, a machine which isn't really known for many of these types of shmups. To see it pull off a conversion like this certainly shows for a lot of hardware mastery. The visuals are clear, and the full screen scrolling is one heck of an achievement, even with the spots of slowdown it gets when things become seriously frantic. If the idea of playing a shmup with an analog joystick doesn't completely offend you, it's well worth checking out, even if only to see just what Woz's Beast can do when really pushed to the limit. I truly wish the C64 conversion fared even half as well as the Apple II version. Quite frankly, the C64 version is an abomination, from its pacing to the visuals and even the SID renditions of the soundtrack. These all combine to create a gestalt of utter mediocrity, and a textbook example of US Gold's slapdash approach to home conversions during this time. In fact, my reactions to this conversion as a kid turned me off the original game for a very long time, and it wasn't until I rediscovered it under emulation that could really give me a chance to appreciate the original game for what it was. On the flip side though, like the Apple II conversion, the ZX Spectrum version is also punching above its weight, making for a solid, if not overly flash take on the game. Outside of the water sections, the visuals are clear and well defined, though of course how that may look on a trusty 48K Spectrum with its RF connection is a bit of another story. The controls are quite solid, and honestly, I do dig the choice to make a more arcade-esque portrait display layout, even if it's more for convenience and speed over that arcade accuracy. It certainly makes for a far more fun experience than on the C64, that is certain. Ultimately though, if you want to play Xevious on an 8-bit home computer, then without a doubt you need to check out Xevious Faudraut Saga on the MSX2. Its recon mode offers a great take on the arcade original, providing visuals on par with the original hardware alongside tight controls and excellently engaging gameplay. This is a more than solid experience, and it's not even half the overall package. Scramble mode is truly where it shines, expanding upon the original arcade game with its extra fighters and pickups. May not seem like much now, but back in 1988, it truly would have felt like a widening experience and a great way to extend and build upon a familiar concept without excessive development time. The foundations from the recon mode are well used here to offer a twist which, whilst not being greatly unique, do make for a fun and challenging shmup in its very own right. Whilst you could say the MSX machines are well known for having a lot of great shmups developed for them, Xevious Faudraut Saga is one which truly deserves a place among those collections, as it's an excellent take on a classic arcade game. And with that, I'm going to leave it here. Thank you all very much for watching.